Japanese Literature. My name is Allison Fincher. Read Japanese Literature is a podcast about Japanese fiction and some of its best works. All the works we discuss are available in translation, so you can read along if you want, and you can find out more at readjapaneseliterature.com. Yasunari Kawabata is one of the most celebrated geniuses of modern Japanese literature. He's one of just 2 Japanese authors to ever win the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was a close associate of Kon Kikuchi, who founded the Akutagawa Prize. He was a contemporary of Junichiro Tanizaki, and he was a mentor of Yukio Mishima. Yasunari Kawabata is also a figure Read Japanese Literature has almost entirely ignored. So today we bring you an episode about the life and work of Yasunari Kawabata, but it's also not the story you'd necessarily get from most English language sources. The episode will include a closer look at 2 of his stories, one from early in his career and one from late in his career. First, The Dancing Girl of Izu, and second, One Arm. 2 quick content warnings. First, Kawabata probably committed suicide, which we'll be discussing. And second, Kawabata was pretty preoccupied with the use of adolescent girls, shoujo, as a metaphor. I did a lot of digging, and as far as I can tell, the creepiness of Kawabata's attitude about shoujo was reserved for his writing. It's still pretty ick. It's something we're going to dive into in detail anyway. I'd like to start out by introducing 2 ideas we're going to be considering through this entire episode. Our careful look at these 2 ideas are what is going to separate the story about Kawabata today from the story you might get from other sources about Kawabata, especially from the story you'd get if you read the work of seminal scholar of Japanese literature Donald Keene. Yasunari Kawabata is often presented as a symbol of old or traditional Japan. As we'll discuss, Kawabata won the 1968 Nobel Prize for Literature, quote, for his narrative mastery, which with great sensibility expresses the essence of the Japanese mind. Specifically in 3 novels full of kimono and geisha and origami and tea ceremony. As Donald Keene summarized the award, it was given to Kawabata, quote, because of the special affinities his works revealed with Japanese traditions. But is Kawabata's writing really that traditional? And was he really that traditional as a human being, as a Japanese person? These are questions we're going to be asking ourselves today. The other idea we'll take up today is that Kawabata has a favorite metaphor, sometimes even a motif, and it's one he returns to again and again and again for his entire oeuvre, his entire body of work. It shows up in his earliest written stories and in work written at the end of his life. Yasunari Kawabata is absolutely preoccupied with virgin girls as symbols of cleanliness and purity. And his fascination with virginal young women is more than a literary conceit. In a fictional letter to his dead parents, Kawabata wrote, "I always fall in love with women who are in between a child and an adult in age. It is almost inconceivable that I should ever feel a deep love for a woman who is completely adult." But in that same letter, he adds that he would never lay a finger on such a girl. Again, to be clear, I could not find any evidence Kawabata was ever accused of sexual misconduct with young women or girls. At least in the English language, there are no clear accusations that he was a pedophile or an ephebophile. But the metaphor is still problematic. During parts of Kawabata's career, he actually co-opted shoujo girls' culture. We'll discuss that more a little later in the episode. And Kawabata's metaphorical use of shoujo is very much an instance of what film theorist Laura Mulvey named the male gaze. The male gaze is a term for a masculine heterosexual perspective that represents women as objects for a male viewer. Women aren't metaphors, y'all. They're people. Yasunari Kawabata was born into a well-established Osaka family in 1899. Both of his parents were dead from tuberculosis by the time he was 4. Kawabata was adopted by his grandparents. His grandmother died by the time he was 7. He was essentially raised by his grandfather, who was blind. Kawabata's only sibling was a sister. She was taken in by an aunt. He only met his sister one more time before his sister died when Kawabata was 11. Poor Kawabata lost so many members of his family so early in life that he was nicknamed the Master of Funerals by some of his peers at school. Kawabata moved to Tokyo alone just before his 18th birthday with the intention of joining the First Higher School. The First Higher School was a prestigious preparatory school. Boys, and only boys, entered it hoping to become students at Japan's premier Tokyo Imperial University. Other alumni of First Higher School include Soseki Natsume, Ryunosuke Akutagawa, and Ginzaburo Yoshino, all of whom we've covered on the RJL podcast. Kawabata passed his entrance exams and began his studies there in the fall of 1917. Kawabata did successfully enroll at Tokyo Imperial University in July 1920, where he began to study English. 1921 was an eventful year for Kawabata. He changed courses from English literature to Japanese literature. Kawabata is actually one of the few prestigious men of letters from 20th century Japan who was more or less monolingual. In the Japanese literature department, Kawabata helped reestablish an important literary magazine called The New Tide of Thought. And that's where he published his first ever published work of fiction, A View from Yasukuni Festival. Donald Keene describes the style of the story as unmistakably modernist. And remember, one of our questions for today is Yasunari Kawabata really a traditionalist? Keene mentions the jagged skips and the author's non-involvement with his characters as modernist features of the story. Partially through Kawabata's own published stories, partially through his work with the magazine, he came to the attention of the literary elite pretty quickly. And remember, in Japan, the word for the literary elite is the bundan. This is the group of men, almost exclusively men, who were in charge of establishing who was a true literary author in early 20th century Japan. Cultural critic Kikuchi Kan, editor of the literary journal Bunge Shunju, was widely recognized as the most powerful figure in the bundan. He went on to be the motivating force behind the founding of the Akutagawa Prize about a decade after he met Yasunari Kawabata. 1921 was also important to Kawabata because it's the year of his great tragic love affair. He met Hatsuyo Ito when she was working as a waitress near the university. He became engaged to her for a month before she broke off the engagement for reasons that are still unknown. Kawabata considered the breaking off of their engagement a betrayal. About the failed engagement, Kawabata wrote, "Everything was broken senselessly, and I was left deeply wounded." At least according to many critics, the experience shows up in Kawabata's work for years. One critic thought the ruined engagement affected Kawabata's portrayal of the dancing girl of Izu, in the short story we'll take a closer look at in just a minute. Also in 1921, Kawabata and a few of his literary friends started a new literary journal called Bunge Jidai, or the Artistic Age. This journal was at the forefront of a new literary movement in Japan. Again, not an old, traditional literary movement, a new one. This new literary movement was called Shinkankakuha. Shin meaning new, kankaku meaning feeling or sensation, ha meaning group or faction or coterie. Sometimes Shinkankakuha is translated into English as Neo-Impressionism, but that's not really it at all. This was a movement about art for art's sake. It was influenced by European Cubism, Expressionism, and Dada. It's probably more accurately rendered as New Sensationalism or New Perceptionism. Kawabata translator J. Martin Holman describes puzzling ellipses, abrupt transitions, and occasionally jarring juxtapositions of images that are both characteristic of New Sensationalism and of Kawabata's writing for the rest of his life. Kawabata and his cohort weren't interested in the nationalism of the writers they had grown up with. These are writers who are honestly barely translated into English. They weren't interested in the proletarian writers that were their contemporaries. Proletarian writing was the other literary movement in vogue in the 1920s. They weren't especially interested in I-novel writing, that autobiographical form that forced writers to reveal their deepest, darkest selves. They were interested in new sensations, writing in which the writer presented new perceptions to the reader. Radically original writing. Kawabata said about this movement, quote, "Our eyes burn with the desire to know the unknown. Our mutual greetings are expressions of our delight at being able to discuss together whatever is new. If one man says good morning and another replies good morning, it is boring. We have become quite weary of literature that is as unchanging as the sun that comes up from the east today as it did yesterday. It is more interesting if one man says, the baby monkey walks along suspended from its mother's belly, and the other replies, white herons really have long talons, don't they?" Yasunari Kawabata published Izu no Odoriko in 1926. The story has been translated as both The Dancing Girl of Izu and The Izu Dancer. The Dancing Girl of Izu has autobiographical roots. During his first year at the first higher school, Kawabata had taken an 8-day trip to Izu. Kawabata referred to the titular girl as a real person, and in the same sentence in which he talked about his lost fiancée. In an autobiographical account from 1934, Kawabata wrote, quote, "I never laid so much as a finger on my fiancée. The same was true of the 13-year-old Izu dancer. And it has been the same ever since, right to the present." Anyway, The Dancing Girl of Izu is also not an obviously modernist story compared to a lot of the writing Kawabata produced in the 1920s. Still, for all that this story seems old-fashioned, there are features that give away its fairly modern setting. The narrator encounters a car. He stays at inns with electric lights. He goes to the cinema. Later in the episode, I'm going to talk about Edward Seidensticker and the part he played in introducing Yasunari Kawabata to the English-speaking world, even the part he played in helping Kawabata win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Izu no Odoriko is the first Kawabata story Seidensticker ever translated. His translation, The Izu Dancer, is not the text I'm using today. It's a good bit more difficult to get a hold of. I wanted to use a text that you could get your hands on. I'll be using J. Martin Holman's translation, The Dancing Girl of Izu, which is still in print, and you can find a link to purchase the book on the episode page. The Dancing Girl of Izu opens on a young narrator, 19 or 20 years old, depending on the translation and whether you're sticking to Japanese age conventions or not. Whether he's 19 or 20, the narrator is right on the cusp of adulthood, at the time 20 years old in Japan. Wearing traditional Japanese clothes, he's making a solitary journey down the Izu Peninsula. The Izu Peninsula is on Honshu's Pacific coastline, just south of Tokyo. When the narrator decides to take shelter from a rainstorm, he finds himself in the company of a dance troupe he has already encountered twice on his 4-day trip. The troupe includes his favorite dancer, a girl who looks like she is 16 or 17 years old, and who, quote, gives the impression of the girls from illustrations in old romances. The reader soon learns that the narrator is fairly preoccupied with this girl. He schemes to have her stay with him in his room that night. Now there's a euphemism. When he fails, the narrator lies awake wondering whose room she is spending the night in. But the next morning, after his failed attempt to spend the evening with the dancing girl, the narrator catches a glimpse of her getting out of the bath, unashamedly naked. Quote, when he gazes at her white body, legs stretched, standing like a young paulownia tree, he feels pure water flowing through his heart. He breathes a sigh of relief and laughs out loud. She's a child who can run out naked in broad daylight. He keeps laughing with delight. His head is clear as though wiped clean. Did you catch all that language about purity and cleansing? The narrator travels with the group the next day and night. Then, out of money, he takes a boat back to Tokyo. On the boat, the narrator allows himself to cry. His head has become clear water, dripping away drop by drop. It is a sweet, pleasant feeling, as though nothing will remain. That's it. That's the story of the Dancing Girl of Izu. Like most of Kawabata's work, the narrative itself isn't the main attraction. It's Kawabata's skill at bringing his reader into new sensory or emotional spaces. Honestly, I suspect there might be a reason Kawabata remains best remembered for the Dancing Girl of Izu. And it's not just about Side & Sticker's translation, which again we'll discuss later. The story is well known, both inside and outside of Japan. In Japan, Izu no Odoriko is so well known that the express trains in Izu are named Odoriko, Dancing Girl. I speculate that readers prefer to remember Kawabata for the Dancing Girl of Izu because it's not that odd to read about a college student having a crush on an adolescent girl, especially because he initially thinks she's much closer to his own age. But Kawabata's characters, like Kawabata himself, keep getting older, even though his love interests never do. In his 30s, Yasunari Kawabata married his wife, Hideko. They had already lived in a common law relationship for 6 years before they registered their marriage. Before they registered their marriage and became formally married, she bore a daughter who died before she could even be named. The couple never had another child. Kawabata publicly expressed his own fear of being a parent. Kawabata also went on to publish a number of works in the 1930s, many of which have been translated into English. Before I introduce the main body of Kawabata's work, I do want to share one interesting quirk about the way Kawabata wrote and published. The man left a lot of his stories unfinished. He would also dash off a story to whatever magazine requested one. That meant different chapters of a single novel could be published in multiple magazines without any explanation of what had already happened or who the characters were. Donald Keene suggests that editors and readers eventually learned to expect that Kawabata's stories would be as much tantalizing fragments as fully realized narratives. Sometimes Kawabata would continue adding chapters to a narrative he had only intended to be one episode long. It's difficult to know whether or not to trust any author talking about his own writing. But Kawabata claimed his 3 best-known novels were all longer than he meant for them to be because of the way he published. Kawabata's first published novel was The Scarlet Gang of Asakusa, which was published serially from 1929 to 1930. It was translated into English by Alyssa Friedman in 2005. The Scarlet Gang of Asakusa was probably Kawabata's most successful use of the new sensationalist style. It's as much a pastiche of observations from a tawdry entertainment district as it is a coherent narrative. Kawabata began work on an even more experimental novel, Crystal Fantasies, but never completed it. It's written in a stream of consciousness style a la James Joyce. I do not believe it has been translated into English. His other notably modernist work includes 146 stories Kawabata called Palm of the Hand stories. These were published throughout his life and career, beginning in 1921. These stories are incredibly short, so short they could fit in the palm of your hand. That's where the name comes from. Kawabata sometimes suggested that this microfiction was the essence of his art. Microfiction is obviously an anachronistic term. That's something we might call these stories today. As a side note, Hiromi Kawakami's collection People from My Neighborhood draws inspiration from Kawabata's Palm of the Hand stories. Kawabata published Snow Country serially from 1935 to 1937. Although he didn't finish fiddling with the individual chapters and publish them collected into the novel we'd recognize today until 1947. Snow Country is almost certainly Kawabata's most famous novel, especially in English. It could have been our focus text today. Frankly, I just don't like it. I personally find it boring and overwrought. You can find the same features of Kawabata's writing in other stories I like a little bit more, or at least find a little more interesting. Snow Country is about a married Tokyo intellectual named Shimamura who travels to a remote hot spring in the snow country to visit a geisha he already knows. The geisha, Komako, is not a high-class Tokyo or Kyoto geisha of the Edo period, but really more of a courtesan. On the way, Shimamura encounters a young girl, Yoko, on the train who is traveling to the same hot spring. An odd little love triangle develops, mostly because Komako isn't young and innocent anymore, but Yoko is. Again, I'm not a fan of this novel. Also in his 30s, during the 1930s, Kawabata became a more prominent member in the Japanese literary scene. In 1933, he joined the staff of several literary magazines. In 1935, Kawabata's friend and mentor, Kikuchi Kan, invited him to join the selection committee for the newly created Akutagawa Prize. Kawabata was one of the reasons Osamu Dazai didn't win the Akutagawa Prize. Kawabata noted, quote, "I regret that dark clouds in Dazai's personal life at the moment seem to be keeping him from expressing his talent more clearly." That's a kind of euphemism for the fact Dazai was pretty strongly addicted to prescription painkillers. Dazai responded by writing a letter to Kawabata in which he promised, "I'll stab you," and he threw rocks at Kawabata's house. I would suggest this is perhaps proving Kawabata's point. Also in 1935, Kawabata was appointed to the Literary Discussion Group, organized by the former head of the Public Security Division of the Home Ministry. The Literary Discussion Group was supposedly a serious attempt to promote a renaissance of Japanese literature. It was actually the increasingly fascist government's attempt to woo writers and invite their collaboration. We'll talk a little more about Kawabata and fascism in just a minute. But first, there's another feature of Kawabata's career in the 1930s that many readers don't know about. Yasunari Kawabata was also known in his day for his shoujo writing for shoujo. Especially in English, almost all studies on Kawabata's career ignore the work he wrote for young girls. Kawabata served on the editorial board for Shoujo no Tomo, Girl's Friend. It was a position he went out of the way to ask for. He attended monthly meetings with shoujo readers present. For listeners who may not be familiar with shoujo or writing for girls, let me provide a very brief review. The genre of girls' fiction started in the late 1800s as didactic or teaching stories. These stories intentionally reinforced ryosai kembo, that a woman's purpose was to be a good wife and wise mother. The stories depicted strong bonds between classmates and friends, and it didn't take that long for classmates and friends in the stories and real life to begin developing crushes and romantic feelings for each other. These romantic relationships and the stories about them were sometimes referred to as esu, for the English letter S. These relationships were considered inherently pure. The endings of these stories weren't always happy. Some of the most beautiful fictional stories about girls' romantic friendships are written with a haunting awareness that they can't last. Several novels were published under his name in Shoujo no Tomo, including The Girl's Harbor, Flower Diary, Beautiful Journey, and Beautiful Journey Continued. The Girl's Harbor and Flower Diary were actually ghost-written by a woman named Tsuneko Nakazato. Nakazato was a well-known writer in her own right. She also went on to become the first female writer to win the Akutagawa Prize, which she won in 1939. It is not clear that Kawabata actually had permission from Nakazato to publish Nakazato's novels as his own. And the novels are still published with Kawabata's name on the cover, even though the publisher now knows the work is attributable to her. On the other hand, Beautiful Journey and its sequel are apparently written in a pretty recognizable Kawabata style. I say apparently because none of these stories have been translated into English. They are well known in Japanese. It turned out Kawabata wasn't actually a very good shoujo writer. He picked a topic for the novels that he actually wrote, Beautiful Journey and its sequel, that didn't have much in common with the normal contents of shoujo magazines. Those stories are about the education of a deaf-blind little girl. Nothing really about beautiful friendship. The inspiration had come partially from Helen Keller's famous 1937 visit to Japan. It was probably a bigger issue that Kawabata wrote in his characteristically elliptical, hard-to-follow style. And it didn't help that the gorgeous illustrations associated with stories in Shoujo no Tomo were soon banned by the government because they were too individualistic. Deborah Shamoon notes that when Kawabata actually writes shoujo stories himself, he strips away all agency and intentionality from the shoujo. She becomes an empty vessel. Kawabata remained, as always, more interested in the symbolic use of shoujo innocence, even when he was writing stories for shoujo. The success of Nakazato's novels, published under Kawabata's name, led to his involvement with the composition movement. The composition movement was a major trend in late 1930s girls' writing. Believe it or not, it actually became cool to write essays. Kawabata thought essays by girls showed off the purity and innocence of girls. He eventually helped collect and produce 6 volumes of girls' essays. Of course, his editorial introductions in these volumes emphasized that their publication wouldn't have been possible without his help. True, but a bit conceited of him to point out. Kawabata also traveled to Manchuria to collect essays, which contributed to his 2-part Beautiful Journey series. Notably, Nobuko Yoshiya, a lesbian shoujo writer RJL covered last season, also traveled to Manchuria for her writing. She does not get the kind of pass for participating in the colonialist exercise or for being complicit with fascism that Kawabata does. We'll discuss that complicity again in just a minute. Overall, Shamoon condemns Kawabata's use of shoujo culture in pretty strong terms. According to Shamoon, while for the girls themselves, shoujo culture was a refuge from patriarchal pressures, for adult men like Kawabata who observed them from the outside, the shoujo was the unknowable other, with her private language and impenetrable relationships, an object of sexual desire, and a sign of idealized nationalism. Critics seem reluctant to think about Kawabata's possible complicity with Japan's wartime government. And it is a little ambiguous. Kawabata accepted money for government prizes and served on government committees in the 1930s, but he also continued to write articles about the importance of free speech. Really, though, there's no denying that Yasunari Kawabata is just as complicit as most Japanese authors of the Pacific War era. Even though Donald Keene defends Kawabata against charges of fascism, he also explains that Kawabata, quote, did not resist wartime pressure on writers. Even though Kawabata did stand up for free speech, he also defended governmental censorship of literature on the philosophical grounds that it was impossible for a writer ever to enjoy absolute freedom. In 1940, Kawabata joined the Japanese Writers Association. 2 years later, he joined the Japanese Literature Patriotic Association. He accepted multiple invitations to visit the Japanese colony of Manchuria, including an invitation by the notorious Kwangtung Army. In 1944, he served as a judge for a War Literature Prize. In 1945, he worked as a naval correspondent. He even visited kamikaze pilots of the Special Attack Force in Kagoshima and stayed with them for a month. Every year, on the anniversary of the outbreak of the Pacific War, Kawabata published newspaper articles about the writing by men killed in action. So while we're apologizing for writers like Nobuko Yoshiya, why does Kawabata get off the hook? I suspect he gets off the hook in part because so much of his work is unfinished. His unfinished novel, Tokaido, isn't translated into English. It includes such gems as Heian culture shows the strength of the women of the time, who established one of the forms of beauty characteristic of the Japanese people. It was the women who used the words Yamato Damashi and Yamato Gokoro with the pride that came from being Japanese at the time of the self-awakening of the race. Both terms do date to the Heian period. Neither began as nationalistic, but Yamato Damashi, or Japanese spirit, and Yamato Gokoro, Japanese heart or mind, evolved into what one scholar called the official rallying cry for the Japanese armed forces in World War II and remain associated with nationalism today. As you'll see at the end of the episode, Kawabata also gets off the hook in part because of the way he was presented to audiences outside of Japan, part of the project that helped him win the Nobel Prize for Literature. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, and Japan's defeat turned out to be a great watershed in Yasunari Kawabata's life. At least according to Kawabata. That November he wrote, "I consider that I have already died, and I do not expect to write even one line in the future except about the beauty of Japan." Shortly after the war, Kawabata became the fourth president of the Japanese Pen Club. As president, he was something like an ambassador on behalf of Japan's writers, both in Japan and at pen congresses in Germany, Brazil, and Norway. In fact, the presidency helped him become perhaps the most internationally visible writer. His international clout increased with Edward Seidensticker's translations of his work, especially The Izu Dancer and Snow Country. Again, we'll talk more about Edward Seidensticker's role in Kawabata myth-making toward the end of the episode. Kawabata's international reputation is tied to the vision of Kawabata's art he seemed to commit himself to shortly after the end of the war, that he would write only about the beauty of Japan. Still, there isn't really a serious break in his style or subject matter, though some of his most famous post-war work does celebrate traditional Japanese culture, especially in and around the city of Kyoto, which is seen as the site of traditional Japanese culture. But other stories and novels are still more experimental and modernist or postmodernist, including One Arm, which we'll look at in more depth in just a minute. Several of Kawabata's most famous later career novels were written concurrently, including Thousand Cranes and The Master of Go. Thousand Cranes was serialized from 1949 to 1952. It's a story that celebrates aspects of traditional Japanese culture. One of its central themes is the way tea ceremony utensils are permanent, but people are not. The Master of Go was serialized from 1951 to 1954. It's about a real-life 1938 Go game of 247 moves that took almost 6 months to complete. An older master was defeated by a younger man. Kawabata considered the novel his masterpiece and the only work he truly completed. The Old Capital, published in 1962, rounds out Kawabata's most famous work celebrating traditional Japan. It's interesting to note that scholar Nina Kornietz argues Kawabata's supposed turn to the beauty of Japan is actually a mark of how willing he was to participate in Japan's Pacific War-era fascist ideology. Let me briefly sum up her argument. Kornietz notes that Jewish-German philosopher Walter Benjamin observes that while communism makes art into only politics, fascism denies that art should have a political component at all. By focusing only on beauty during and after the war, Kawabata is buying into the Japanese fascist project, or even propping it up. And Kornietz argues against the reevaluation of their wartime ideology by most writers and artists in the post-war, Kawabata instead became more aestheticist in the manner Kornietz believes is consistent with a system of representation collusive with fascist ideology. I don't want to dig too deeply into Kornietz's argument because it would require too much time to really do justice to it. But it's pretty compelling. If you have access to a university library or a library system with a good interlibrary loan system, or you feel like paying for a copy of the book The Culture of Japanese Fascism, Kornietz's article, Fascist Aesthetics and the Politics of Representation in Kawabata Yasunari, is well worth a read. If the title and the article title were hard to recall orally, all of that information is in the sources listed on the episode page. After World War II, Kawabata also continued to write popular fiction. His Tokyo People was serialized from 1954 to 1955. It was published in 505 installments and eventually collected in 4 volumes. Kawabata was fairly scornful of his popular work. Then again, the Bundan would have expected him to reject anything that wasn't pure literature, even if a Bundan author had produced it himself. And of course, Kawabata continued to write about shoujo. He published his novel The Lake in installments in 1954. Donald Keene describes The Lake as, quote, the unpleasant, even repulsive account of a man who chases after young girls. The protagonist's behavior is so blatantly wrong that Keene remarks, quote, the love of the maidenly is twisted into the furtive behavior of a voyeur, and that, quote, the reader may even at times feel like The Lake is what a Kawabata novel might be reduced to were it not for this beauty of style. By the way, don't confuse Kawabata's The Lake with Banana Yoshimoto's The Lake, which I believe we'll discuss in our next episode. The House of the Sleeping Beauties, published in 1961, is even more alarming. It's about a secretive establishment where old men pay for the privilege of sleeping next to sedated, naked, virginal women. I'd like to take a quick dive into Kawabata's 1964 story, One Arm, which Donald Keene called Kawabata's last important work of fiction. One Arm opens with a bizarre offer from the girl. I don't have access to a copy of the Japanese, but I suspect the word here is shoujo. The girl says, I can let you have one of my arms for the night. Now, for all Kawabata is known as a traditionalist author, One Arm is not a traditional story. It's thoroughly magical realist at its core. We talked about magical realism in a Season 2 episode, Japanese Magical Realism, and we introduced Wendy Farris's characteristics of magical realist fiction. One Arm checks most of the boxes. Magical realist fiction has an irreducible element of magic that can't be explained according to the laws of the universe as we know them. This girl is going to loan her arm, the physical arm that is attached to her torso. So, check. The realism of magical realism is really real. Everything about the story, except the loan of the arm, is perfectly realistic and reasonable. Check. And magical realist fictions question received ideas about time, space, and identity. One Arm certainly makes the reader question who the narrator is and how separate he truly is from the girl. So, check. The narrator takes the girl up on the offer. It's a first-person narrator, which is fairly unusual for Kawabata. The reader eventually learns that he is just 33, about half as old as Kawabata was when he wrote the story. The narrator is, unsurprisingly, kinda creepy about the arm. He opines that the arm has, quote, the roundness of a beautiful Occidental, Western, girl, rare in a Japanese, and when the girl was no longer clean, that gentle roundness would fade, grow flabby. He also notes that the arm is like her breasts, not yet touched by a man. The narrator also has conversations with the girl's arm. The arm's voice is like the voice of a woman who has decided to give herself to the narrator, not one as beautiful as the girl who had lent him the arm. The narrator eventually replaces his own arm with the girl's arm, as in he removes the limb attached to his own torso at the shoulder and sticks hers there instead. And then he sucks on the fingers that were formerly hers, now his. Toward the end of the story, the narrator begins to worry about what will happen to the girl when he returns the arm. The clean blood of the girl was now, at this very moment, flowing through him, but would there not be an unpleasantness when the arm was returned to the girl, this dirty male blood flowing through it? The story ends when the narrator wakes up to a startling sensation, his own remaining arm touching the arm he has borrowed from the girl. He holds it tight to his chest and embraces it as one would a small child from whom life was going. And he sucks on the fingers, again. If the dew of woman would but come from between the long nails and the fingertips. Really wish I had the Japanese original to decode what side and sticker has here as dew of woman. It might strike you that this story is not very plot heavy. It's a narrative that could be told in a couple of sentences, but a whole lot of information about what the narrator thinks and feels. You'd be right to make this observation. Really, a lot of Kawabata's writing sticks to the new sensationalism he conceived as a very young man, conveying new ideas, but mostly new sensations to the reader. Yasunari Kawabata won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968, exactly 100 years after the Meiji Restoration created the somewhat arbitrary line between early modern and modern Japanese literature. Kawabata wasn't the first Japanese writer to be considered for the Nobel Prize for Literature. Judges apparently gave Junichiro Tanizaki serious consideration. He is most famous in English, possibly also in Japanese, for his novel The Makioka Sisters, but the man was a truly prolific writer. He is also the other 20th century writer that read Japanese literature has seriously neglected. Many critics of Japanese literature, both foreign critics and Japanese ones, think that Tanizaki was by far the living writer of the 1960s more deserving of Nobel recognition. Yukio Mishima was a relative newcomer compared to Kawabata and Tanizaki, but he had also been considered for the award. So why Kawabata? Scholar Yoshio Iwamoto puts forward the argument with which many others have agreed. Kawabata was just more exotic to Nobel judges, especially when you think about Kawabata work that was available in translation. Anders Osterling, permanent secretary of the Swedish Academy, described how Kawabata combines a, quote, moral aesthetic cultural awareness with unique artistry, thereby in this way contributing to the spiritual bridge building between East and West. According to the Swedish Academy, Kawabata won the prize, quote, for his narrative mastery, with which great sensibility expresses the essence of the Japanese mind. Kawabata certainly played up his Japaneseness in his Nobel lecture, which he titled Japan, the Beautiful and Myself. It begins with a long evaluation of haiku by two Zen priests, Dogen and Myoe. Myoe's poetry is of, quote, warm, deep, delicate compassion that has in it the deep quiet of the Japanese spirit. In fact, Kawabata organizes his entire lecture around a series of quoted haiku that are supposed to demonstrate various points about the Japanese spirit. Kawabata goes on to evaluate the role Zen Buddhism plays in the arts of Japan: Japanese writing, Japanese poetry, Japanese painting, Japanese gardens. A side note that Nina Kornietz observes that even Kawabata's presentation of Zen in his lecture echoes Pacific War-era fascism. The 20th century Zen Buddhism Kawabata was presenting as traditionally Japanese was a fundamentally different practice than that of the samurai, or the Zen Buddhist haiku poets. It had been a religion practiced by a military aristocratic minority. It had been remade for the masses, presented as part of the fundamental Japanese character in a nationalistic way, and used as a filter to reinterpret centuries of Japanese art. Kawabata's lecture concludes, "Here we have the emptiness, the nothingness of the Orient. My own works have been described as works of emptiness, but it is not to be taken for the nihilism of the West. The spiritual foundation would seem to be quite different." When Kenzaburo Oe won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1994, he used his lecture, Japan, the Ambiguous and Myself, partially to dissect Kawabata's lecture. Oe calls Kawabata's lecture, Japan, the Beautiful and Myself, at once very beautiful and vague. According to Oe, Kawabata talked about a unique kind of mysticism, Zen Buddhism, which is found not only in Japanese thought, but also more widely Oriental thought. Oe's Japan is more, well, ambiguous. It's split between two opposite poles of ambiguity. Japan has attempted to be modern and open to what Oe calls the West, while remaining in Asia and trying to maintain its traditional culture. Oe thinks of himself as a writer with this polarization imprinted on himself like a deep scar. I suspect a more honest evaluation of Kawabata's writing would identify this ambiguity, this polarization, in Kawabata's work too. On April 16, 1972, Yasunari Kawabata died of gas inhalation. Most biographers regard his death as a suicide. His wife, as well as some close associates and friends, and at least one journalist, think the death was accidental. Kawabata didn't leave a note, which has led many people to speculate about why he committed suicide, if he committed suicide at all. Suicide isn't an unusual cause of death among writers, especially 20th century Japanese ones. Ryunosuke Akutagawa, Osamu Dazai, and Yukio Mishima all famously died by suicide. Yukio Mishima's suicide may have contributed to Kawabata's. Mishima was something of a Kawabata protege. One biographer claimed Kawabata had been having nightmares almost nightly since Mishima slit his own belly open as a political act in November 1970. Other biographers speculate Kawabata may have been responding to a Parkinson's diagnosis. If Kawabata committed suicide, he did not intend for it to be a performance the way his protege had. In an essay called The Eyes of the Dog, Kawabata had written, "However alienated one may be from the world, suicide is not a form of enlightenment. However admirable he may be, the man who commits suicide is far from the realm of the saint." Kawabata had even quoted this passage from his essay in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. I've provided a lot of information in this episode about Yasunari Kawabata, but I want to come back to those two big ideas for today and pose them as questions. Why is it that Yasunari Kawabata is generally regarded by non-Japanese readers as this paragon of traditional Japan? And why does he get a pass for the way he writes about shoujo? Well, as Yasunari Kawabata grew older and Japanese popular culture became more fascist, Kawabata certainly cast himself in the role of traditionalist. As early as 1934, he wrote, "I have received the baptism of modern Western literature, and I have myself imitated it, but basically I am an Oriental, and for 15 years I have never lost sight of my bearings." Deborah Shamoun also quotes Hiromi Ochi's explanation that Kawabata, the Nobel laureate, was the creation of translations by American Edward Seidensticker. According to Shamoun, Seidensticker's translations are informed by trends in American academia of the 1950s. Communism was a tempting force to post-World War II intellectuals. Providing exotic cultural visions from a non-communist country was a way to present alternatives. If all of this sounds a little too much like I should be wearing a tinfoil hat, allow me to share that Seidensticker's earliest translation, A Cherry by Osamu Dazai, appeared in Encounter magazine. Encounter was run by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was later revealed to be a CIA-funded false front. Seidensticker's first translation of Kawabata was in a special edition of the more legitimate Atlantic Monthly, but that special edition was published with support from the Ford Foundation, and that support from the Ford Foundation had actually been provided by the CIA. Seidensticker also chose to translate Kawabata novels that most easily fit the image of what he thought Americans would expect from Japanese stories. Almost all of Seidensticker's Kawabata translations are of novels that reinforce Americans' most basic stereotypes of traditional Japanese culture, and Kawabata's claim that he was only writing about Japanese beauty. Seidensticker translated 2 of the 3 novels that the Nobel Prize Committee cited, Snow Country and Thousand Cranes. The third, The Old Capital, was translated into other European languages before 1968, but not English. We didn't get English language translations of Kawabata's more experimental Palm of the Hand stories until 1988, or the more modernist The Scarlet Gang of Asakusa until 2005. Neither translation is by Seidensticker. Seidensticker's was a pretty Orientalist approach to translation, at least when it came to Kawabata. Seidensticker also continued to play the role of Kawabata whisperer for American and European readers. He even accompanied Kawabata to Stockholm as his interpreter when Kawabata traveled to accept the Nobel. The other question is why Anglophone readers almost never grapple with Kawabata's use of shoujo. The answer here is probably a combination of factors. Kawabata is less widely read in 2026 than some other paragons of 20th century Japanese literature, so a lot of readers just don't know about the shoujo issue. English language scholarship almost never considers Kawabata and shoujo, especially the scholarship outside of academic journals. If you're getting your information about Japanese authors from sources like Donald Keene, it's not going to come up. And sometimes English language readers are understandably reluctant to call out behaviors of writers or artists in a culture dramatically different from our own,
It reminds me of the way author Keiichiro Hirano talked about Yukio Mishima when I was able to interview him back in the fall of 2024. You can find the entire interview on the episode page. Hirano noted, in the last 15 years, he had had the honor and opportunity to be on panels at 3 very big international symposiums on Mishima in Paris, Berlin, and Tokyo. As we probably know, Mishima yelled, "Long live the emperor," before committing seppuku. Yet all these foreign scholars never brought it up, and all they talked about was Mishima's literature. They completely ignored the fact that he was an imperialist to the day he died. That was really kind of jarring to Hirano. It really didn't sit well with him. So, why should you read the work of Yasunari Kawabata? As I pointed out in a Season 1 episode about Osamu Dazai, some books really aren't worth it for some readers. Kawabata's use of shoujo as a metaphor is a lot. Still, Yasunari Kawabata is one of the most important Japanese writers of the 20th century. He's the first Japanese writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and his writing influenced a huge number of writers who came after him. If you read Kawabata, don't limit yourself to Snow Country and The Dancing Girl of Izu. Make sure you read something more distinctively modern, like his Palm of the Hand stories, or even One Arm. Today we've looked at The Dancing Girl of Izu, translated by J. Martin Holman, and One Arm, translated by Edward Seidensticker. North Americans can buy most of the books I mention on the podcast from Read Japanese Literature's Bookshop to support Read Japanese Literature. I want to offer a special thank you to Patreon supporters. You can join them by visiting patreon.com/Read Japanese Literature. We'd love to hear from you about the podcast. You can reach us through Patreon, through the website readjapaneseliterature.com, through Blue Sky at readjapaneseliterature.com. We had a great discussion a few weeks ago about why Kawabata may get off the hook for his fascist ties, and on YouTube /at readjapaneseliterature. A big thank you to the Japanese literature communities on Blue Sky and Goodreads, and thank you as always to producer Kaim for today's music, khaimmusic.com.